In this lesson, we're going to go over the use of some tools. I'm going to take a look specifically at a tool that you would use for doing iPhone forensics. Now, when you have an iPhone or an iPad, when you plug it in and you synchronize it with iTunes, what it does is it creates a directory in your library. So library is actually a hidden file, and rather than going through the process of turning on hidden files inside Finder, I'm just going to go through this way, since you can see it just as well in the terminal as you can in the Finder. So now I'm going to go to Mobile Sync, and I've got a file or directory called Backup, and here I've got a directory where the backup actually lives. So you can see there's a bunch of files in here having to do with the backup. So I've got one device, as it turns out, and I've done one backup, which is why there's only one directory. So I'm going to use this program called iPhone Backup Extractor, and it's going to read the backups, and what that does is it goes into the directory where my backups are stored, and there's one device there, and you can see the different applications that are stored here in this particular backup. And so I could select any one of these and do an extract of it, and can put that in downloads. And I could now extract that backup into this directory here. So I've now got org.wikimedia.wikipedia, and I've got documents here. I've got a log file. You can see there's some information that was logged by the application, and I've got a library. So I've got preferences, and I could open up the preferences here. This is one of those SQLite databases that I had mentioned in another lesson. Apple uses SQLite databases to store information. So we've got a SQLite database here, and I could actually go to, I've got Deft Linux, and I could actually go to the SQLite database browser. So I've got this SQLite database browser, and I could open up, and if I go into Documents, now I've got my SQLite database. So you can see here I've got the database open, and I've got some client information and object values, and now I've got sources. So this is the database structure that I'm looking at here. So you can see the database structure. Now I can browse data, and it doesn't look like there's actually any data in here, although here's some in object values, which doesn't really have much of anything useful. Now sources, I've got one source URL, and that's it. So not a lot interesting in this particular database, but once you've extracted information from these applications, you can go into the SQLite database and see what these applications are storing. So this happens to be one application that's about Wikimedia, and you could certainly look at any other application that you could find from an iPhone or an iPad backup that you were able to acquire. Now, the thing about this particular application is it requires the backup to live inside of the user that you are logged in as. So I would have to have connected a device and done a backup from it, which is actually what I did here. So I had iTunes, and I can just right click on the device and I can do a backup here. So that's what I did. And now I've got a backup inside the right directories in my user. And when I run this backup extractor that we had open down here, now it reads the backup, finds all of the applications, as I said, and I can now go pull those off. And actually, let's extract the iOS files and see what we get here. So now we're extracting the iOS files. Now I've got iOS files, and it looks like I've got a couple of SQLite databases, and we could go back into Deft and open up the SQLite browser again and take a look at that trust database and just see what's in there. So I'm going to go browse to the directory where I have that SQLite database stored. It was in downloads, and that was in iOS files. So I have a trust store, and we can go browse the data, and it doesn't look like there's anything in this particular one. There are some trust settings that are there, but it doesn't look like there's actually any data that's really stored in that database. It does look like this is where the picture files are stored, though, so I can see some images that were stored from the camera, or the camera took some pictures and stored them here in this iOS files. And if I've got recordings, there are a couple of M4A files and a recordings.db. So there are a number of files here that were collected from the iOS files. And if we open up the library, we've got the address book database and the calendar database and the call history database. And let's actually open that call history database and see what we can find from the call history database. So back to media, and then downloads, iOS files, library, call history. So that actually opens up inside the SQLite database, and it does look like I've got some data there under the properties, and we do have some calls that show up. So it does look like there's some data in this call history database. So here's where you could easily extract call history from your iPhone using this sort of mechanism. Now, there are utilities that are available for Windows that will do much the same thing as the tools that we've been using here with the iPhone backup extractor, and you can get a SQLite database browser available for macOS or for Windows as well, and you can go through this same process of pulling the backup apart and opening up the databases and seeing what's actually stored in there. So here's a couple of tools where you can pull apart iPhone or iPad backups and do some forensic analysis on the data that you find inside of those backups.